All right, lovely. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for waiting and for your patience. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Elizabeth Underhill, and I'm here tonight with my colleague Lindsay Doran. She will be our moderator this evening. And of course, we are with our very special guest, Darin Wybenga, who joins us from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So thanks for being here tonight with us, Darin. We're looking forward to your talk. So in just a few moments, Darin will be sharing some of the history of First Nations veterans from the Mississaugas of the Credit that fought in the First World War, and as well as their experiences with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So we will get to that shortly. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the land on which we work and create. We acknowledge that this is the traditional territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the traditional homeland of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee First Nations. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and global Indigenous peoples who call this region home today. We acknowledge all of the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, and we acknowledge that these words only hold meaning if they were followed by thoughtful action and a commitment to listening and learning. And just before Lindsay introduces our speaker tonight, I will share a little housekeeping presentation with you. So please bear with me while I finagle this onto my screen here. Okay, I think you should be able to see that now. All right. So as Darin goes through his talk this evening, it will look like this on your screen, and myself, Lindsay, and Darin will be up here at the top, hanging out. As I mentioned earlier, you are muted and your videos are off. But we do welcome your questions. We will be saving about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the talk for your questions. So to enter questions, if you haven't found it yet, just have a look for the Q&A panel down here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if that somehow disappears or closes on you, you can reopen it again here on this little icon. For those of you who may be having any audio issues, this is how you can switch your audio, is by clicking these three little dots here. And you can switch your audio settings. So hopefully we are good for the sound tonight. And if you would like to change the way your screen looks, you have an icon up here in the corner where you can reconfigure the way all of us talking heads look on your screen. Okay, so I will stop our presentation now. Lindsay?
Okay, so everyone can hear me? Yes?
We're good, yes.
We're good? Excellent.
Thank you.
Hello everyone. This talk is presented by the Museums of Mississauga in conjunction with War Flowers, an immersive multi-century exhibition that focuses on the stories of 10 Canadians in the First World War, on view now until December 13th at the Living Arts Centre. Pre-booked tickets are available through the Living Arts Centre box office, and they are free. The talk also complements the exhibition Our Voice, currently on view at the Bradley Museum and Benares Historic House, that reflects on soldiers from Mississauga who lost their lives in the First World War. And those are also free as part of the tour here. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Prior to working with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Darin Wybenga was an educator in private day schools located in Southern Ontario. Specializing as a teacher of history and geography, he also served as a vice principal and curriculum coordinator. He was the vice president of the Ontario Christian School Teachers Association and served as a history curriculum writer for the Ontario Alliance of Christian Schools. In recent years, he has worked for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as the archival assistant responsible for cataloging and digitizing the historical documents. He then worked as a community history researcher in a project involving the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the University of Waterloo, wherein he completed the genealogical research that traced every Mississauga of the Credit First Nation band member's family roots back to the Credit River Mission Village. Currently, he is the Traditional Knowledge and Land Use Coordinator at the Department of Consultation and Accommodation, where he helps to educate proponents about the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and its history. He has also served as the community's librarian since 2011. And now I will pass it over to you.
Am I okay now? Wonderful. It's good to be here with you this evening. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It's, like I said, wonderful to be here. A bit unreal doing things on video. I'm used to standing in front of a classroom or lecture hall or some such thing. It's all kind of surreal for me to be doing this sort of thing. But nevertheless, here we are in the age of COVID, and we'll try and give it our best shot. Like I said, it's a bit unreal. And it's kind of like our Remembrance Day services just last week. Last Sunday, usually the Sunday before Remembrance Day, the First Nation gets together at its war memorial and holds our commemoration. But sadly, with COVID, that couldn't happen, and so we had to settle for a virtual event. And that's just, it just doesn't do it for me. I'm sure it doesn't do it for a lot of people. But like I said, we're going to make do. So what I'm going to try and do now, if I can remember all my little... There we go. We've got that screen up. Now I'm going to hit slideshow from the beginning. Oops, can fix that. Wonderful. I think we're in good shape right now. So let's just the intro slide so we can go on. And so this, what you have before you right now is a picture of our Veterans Memorial. It's in a grove of Carolinian forest. And if you look at our Veterans Memorial, it's actually in the shape of a burial mound. Way, way back in the day, several hundred years ago, after a battle, we often heaped up the dead and buried them in a mound. And so that's what that kind of represents there. You'll also see some granite pillars with flames on them. That is representative of the fact that the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation are a subgroup of the Ojibwe people, and that means we're a member of the Three Fires Confederacy. So we're allied with the Potawatomi people and the Odawa people. And like I said, we are part of the Ojibwe members of that group. So if you were to come to our memorial on Remembrance Day, you'd see things that you would recognize elsewhere in Canada. Wherever you went, you might see the wreath laying, you might hear the last post, you might hear the national anthem, and there'll usually be some dignitaries. But one of the things a couple of things we do that are a bit different is we have drumming and singing in Ojibwe. We call them honor songs to honor our veterans. And the other thing that we do is rather unique, I'm told, is that we just don't remember our veterans from World War I, World War II, and the Korean conflict. We try and remember all of our warriors from as far back as we can possibly remember. If we know your name and you've been in a conflict, we try and remember that. And if you look at our mounds, you'll see there's 2 slabs here. There's actually 4 slabs, each representing the 4 directions. And what is carved on those slabs is the names of our warriors. So we have people carved, the names of people that have participated in the War of 1812, the American Civil War, the Boer War, the First and Second World Wars, the Korean conflict, and even peacekeeping participation. You don't have to pay the ultimate sacrifice to be on our memorial. You've just had to participate as a warrior. So we're a little different that way. And on Remembrance Day, you will hear us read out the names of every veteran. And really, this is a work in progress, because as soldiers enlist in the military, even today, their names will be added on to the Veterans Memorial. But anyway, we're here to talk about World War I today, and we'll get started with that right away. Now, let me just, and see, I've already got my slides messed up. Isn't that wonderful? Wonderful. I find the best way to organize my thinking around World War II and First Nations involvement in it is to think about how they were treated upon enlisting in the Army, whether they were welcomed or not. And the war breaks out, and initially we're not welcome into the conflict. In the midst of the war, 1915, 1916, we're welcomed with open arms. And by the time we get to 1917 and 1918, people actually want to conscript us into the Army. So something to think about as we go through this. So war is declared in 1914. And the funny thing about it, well, maybe not so funny, was it was only supposed to be a small event. Maybe it'd be over in a short time. It wouldn't take a lot of manpower. As a matter of fact, Canada's 1st Division is only supposed to be 25,000 men. And really, when the call for volunteers goes out, we have no problem. Canada has no problem filling those 25,000 spots, mostly with people of British extraction. But you know, First Nations people wanted to participate, and that was a question that many military recruiters wanted to know. And they asked at the time, do we or should we enlist First Nations people? I'm going to call them Indians here because that's the term I use and I feel comfortable with. I say this myself because I'm an Indian under the Indian Act. My mother was an Indian and my grandparents are Indian, so I feel very comfortable with that. So forgive me. I know sometimes we like to use First Nations or Indigenous or Aboriginal, but for my purposes tonight, I will just as soon use Indian. So we're here. People want to know, do we recruit First Nations people? Do we recruit Indian people into the service? And the answer from Sir Sam Hughes, he's the Minister of the Militia, the head of defense, was a very cautious maybe. Here's what he said. He replies to one inquiry about enlisting Indians. While British troops would be proud to be associated with their fellow subjects, meaning First Nations people or Indians, Germans might refuse to extend to them the privilege of civilized warfare. Therefore, it's considered that they'd better remain in Canada to share in the protection of the Dominion. So, Sam Hughes, okay, it's not official policy. There's no law that says First Nations people can't enlist in the military, but it's not encouraged. And that lack of encouragement's semi-official until 1915. But some of our men do end up joining up. And two of them in particular join in 1914 as soon as the war's on. And you have his picture right here. His name is Cameron Brant. And you might be familiar with the name Brant because if you know your Canadian history well, he is the grandson, the great-great-grandson of Chief Joseph Brant, the Mohawk war chief of the Six Nations. So he comes from a very, very esteemed family. His family has lived among the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation from the early 1800s on. His parents are Lydia and Robert Brant, very devout people, very Christian people, and very, very much in favor of educating their children. And Cameron, born in 1887, is a very well-educated First Nations person for that day and age. He goes to New Credit Day School. He graduates from there. He moves on to the high school in nearby Hagersville and graduates there. So right there, graduating from both grade school and high school, He's even a step above many of his neighbors in the nearby town of Hagersville, and he's clearly above most of his fellow First Nations people living on the New Credit Reserve. So he's doing that. He's a member of the militia for 6 years, the 37th Haldimand Rifles. He's a member there. He attends military college in London, Ontario, and even attends summer camps in Niagara-on-the-Lake for military training. We even hear tell that from a very young age, he was very much into military things, reading about wars and so on. So that's kind of who Cameron Brandt is. And when he signs up in 1914, he's among the very first people that make it overseas. Okay. Now, and he's a very important man in a sense that is a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. He's our band member. He's associated with the Six Nations Reserve due to his great-great-grandfather. He is associated with Brant County, and he's also associated with Hamilton, Ontario, because he moves there early before the war breaks out to make a living as a sheet metal worker. He gets married in 1911, and he and his bride go off to Hamilton and hopefully are going to build a life for themselves away from New Credit. So 1914, he joins up. 1915, he's in France, and he finds himself in the first big battle for Canadians in the First World War, the Second Battle of Ypres. A major battle, of course, first for the Canadians, but also known for its use of poison gas for the very first time. And it's a bad situation. The Canadians are in the line at Ypres. The French Algerian troops to the left of them retreat in the face of the poison gas, and Brandt and the rest of the Canadian division stays in the line, holding the line while the Germans attack. And they actually succeed in holding that line. But sadly enough, Lieutenant Cameron Brandt is killed the day after the battle starts. I think 2 days after the battle starts, on April 24th in 1915. Now, very proud of him as a band member, but we had nothing tangible of his. We have a drawing of him, we have a few photographs of him, but we had nothing tangible of Cameron Brandt. And sitting there as a librarian looking after the military collection, I always wished we had more artifacts from the First World War and our soldiers. And lo and behold, 2014, the summer before we're ready to commemorate the war, a couple artifacts fall in our hands. Now, this book, I was working in the library one day, and I got a call from a lady in Picton, Ontario. She said to me on the phone, would you like a book owned by Cameron Brandt? And I'm thinking, oh boy, I'd like that, but I was highly skeptical. What could she possibly mean? She explained that she was a bookseller selling used books in Picton, Ontario, and she'd been going through the materials, and she found this book, and would I be interested in it? Still skeptical, I said yes, and she said fine. She put it in the post. 2 weeks later, this book arrives at the library. I open it up. It's Songs of a Sourdough by Robert W. Service, and I open up the front cover, and inside it, it says Cameron Brandt, Bustard Camp, England, 1st Division, 1st Canadian Division, CEF, and then it talks, and it has his signature. I thought, oh my goodness, I might have something really, really spectacular here. I go compare the signature to Brandt's enlistment papers. We know them as attestation papers. I check it, and sure enough, the signature matches what's inside the front cover. Wow, we have something that Cameron Brandt purchased while he was in England, waiting to go to France, and it's something that he would have read while he was in the trenches, in the downtimes in the trenches. So very, very exciting for us to have that. And it really tickles me that we have this, because it really upsets the stereotypes of First Nations warriors. When you think about it, First Nations warriors, mainly because we have a long history of warfare, fighting for Britain, fighting against Britain, fighting against France, and there's all these stories of ferocious First Nation warriors, and he goes against that stereotype. What's he doing in his downtime in the trenches? He's reading a book of poetry. So I love that. And it's wonderful that we've obtained that book. Now, no sooner had I obtained that book, Songs of Sourdough, then I got another call, this time from the band office, and the receptionist said, "You have to come over here. There's a gentleman that wants to give some medals to the library." And I thought, medals? I wonder who they could belong to. I cross the parking lot, and I'm in a hurry because I'm excited, and a gentleman hands me over these 4 medals in a bag, a sandwich bag. And I thought, okay, I know they're medals. And if you look at the edge of the medals, they have the name of the recipients inscribed on them. And I lift one up and look, Cameron Brandt. Thought, wow. All of a sudden, we have 2 sets of artifacts. We have the book, and now we have the medals. Even more astounding. The gentleman told me he found them while he was ripping apart a house for renovation in a nearby town of Selkirk. And he wasn't sure how they got there. He found them in the mantelpiece. And I asked, "Do you know the name of the family that was living there?" And he said, "It's the Smith family." So all well and good, I go back to the library and I look up Cameron Brandt's wife's, she was widowed, of course. She gets remarried and she ends up marrying a Walter Smith. And suddenly it becomes clear to me how the medals made it to this house in Selkirk, Ontario. So we're very, very pleased about that. We don't know why they were secreted where they were, but nevertheless, we're very pleased to have these medals as well. So very, very grateful. So that's Cameron Brandt. Interesting thing about these ribbons too, these ribbons, you see, are not correctly placed on the medals themselves. The true ribbon should be reversed. My friends at Fort York told me that these medals came separately in the mail from the medals. So it was up to the recipient, or in this case, the widow, to match the ribbons with the medal. She did it incorrectly, but anyway, it's an interesting story to this event. And like I said, wonderful for us, two tangible items or sets of artifacts from Cameron Brandt. Okay, moving right along. Well, now I got to go back again because, oh, there we go. I think I'm in the right spot again. Remember how I said initially in 1914, First Nations people were not encouraged to join up, but the situation changes in 1915, 1916. There's been a bloodletting in Europe, of course. The British are especially feeling somewhat distraught over the loss of their manpower, and they reach out to the British colonies, her dominions, including Canada, Indian, South Africa, those places, and ask for them to actively recruit Indigenous people. And that request is going to be fulfilled by Robert Borden, our Prime Minister. Prime Minister Borden has made a pledge of his own, which makes the recruitment of First Nations people needed. He's promised the British that he will put first 250,000 troops in the field, and shortly thereafter he ups it to another 500,000 troops in the field. So he's got a lot of manpower that he has to recruit. And so he turns to First Nations people and actively seeks out their participation in the war effort. All well and fine, and especially for our wonderful friends at the Department of Indian Affairs. For those of you that don't know, Department of Indian Affairs is the arm of the government that regulates First Nations people lives. It did back then, and it does now. As a First Nations people, I follow under rules and regulations by the Indian Act, and so did my relatives here. And I will say this, these 6 gentlemen are my relatives, all of them. Meet Dan, Sam, Peter, Wesley, Elias, and Herb. They're all members of the Herbleform family, and my paternal, I guess we would say, great uncles, and they all participated in this war, and gladly all of them came back. We're not sure when this picture was taken. We know for sure, however, that it was taken prior to 1917, because after 1917, the buttons on the tunics that you see, there were only 5 of them. These fellows here all have 7 buttons. That's how we know it's a pre-1917 picture. But they all joined up in the very late 1915, very late and early 1916. So if you look at this picture, you see Dan and Peter, they are brothers. If you look at Wesley and Elias, they are brothers. And that leaves Herb and Sam, and they are cousins to each other and cousins to everyone else. So we have a real family picture here. And I use them to point out is that to help me illustrate the power of recruiting. Before, we just had Cameron Brant and Albert Crane going off to war in 1914. All of a sudden, there's active recruiting of First Nations people. The Department of Indian Affairs actually sends out a recruiter to talk to First Nations people in this area and the nearby 6 nations. But there's a bit of an ulterior motive here with the Indian Department. The head of the Department of Indian Affairs is a man by the name of Duncan Campbell Scott. If you're familiar with him at all, he's a poet, but he's also a bureaucrat. And like I said, he's head of the Indian Department, and here's his view of dealing with First Nations people. Here's a quote from him. "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." And Scott's plan for doing this was assimilation. The First Nations people are to be assimilated into Canadian society. And lo and behold, what a way to do this. What better way to do this than to encourage First Nations enlistment in the Army. And there they will be exposed to new people, new wonders, new sights, an example of civilization, whatever that means. And they won't return to their old Indian ways. The Indian will become one with his neighbor in speech, in life, and in habits. Quaint customs, ceremonies, and the musical cadence and speech of the First Nations will be extinct as the buffalo and the tomahawk. And the teepee will give way to the settler cabin and the settler farm. At least that was the plan. We'll see later on if it worked out. So there you've been introduced to my distant relatives, all but, put it this way, these 5 gentlemen joined the 116th Battalion. And that's a special battalion because it's known as the Indian Battalion in circles, mainly because of its large composition of Indigenous people. Now, this was recruited largely from the Haldimand County and the 6 Nations Reserve. If you know where our reserve is located, we're located right next door to the 6 Nations of the Grand Reserve. Okay, we're a much smaller population. 6 Nations even today has a population 10 times our size, but back in 1914, our population at New Credit was 286 people, a very, very tiny First Nation. Altogether, we recruited, or we put into the Army, I should say, 36 of our band members, which is a substantial amount for a small population of ours. And most of them, matter of fact, 22 of them joined what is known as the 114th Battalion, the Indian Battalion. Now, like I said, largely composed of First Nations people. Whoops, now we got to go back and I got to be a little bit creative here. Ah, wonderful. So they joined the 114th Battalion. It's a battalion composed of about 700 men. That includes officers, soldiers and officers. And half of that amount consists of the Six Nations, roughly of Indigenous warriors, and 2/3 of that consist of Six Nations warriors. If you look at the badge here, the collar badge, you'll notice it has a pair of crossed tomahawks on it. That it symbolizes the large amount of First Nations participation in this battalion. And you'll see another thing, just maybe, it's hard to see on this badge. It says Brock's Rangers. Now, the reason they were called Brock's Rangers is because the lieutenant colonel of the battalion, his name is Andrew Thompson, he's a local MP from the area, by the way, he petitions the government and asks to use that name because many of the First Nations people from Six Nations and even New Credit, their ancestors had fought with General Brock of War of 1812 fame at Queenston Heights. And so it seemed like a good fit. And it tied the First Nations people to the British and past efforts on behalf of the British. Now, like I said, very proud of the battalion. And whoops, no, there we go again. There we have the Six Nations women put together a battalion flag for the 114th. And here it is. And you notice, obviously, very, very First Nations, several different types of clan animals on it, including a turtle, a hare, and a wolf. And there's a few birds here. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the battalion flag. So you can see in the battalion flag, you can see on the collar badge, the Indigenous influences of that battalion. Like I said, 22 of our band members joined that battalion. And in 1916, May 16th, 1916, there was a general meeting of New Credit at its council house. Everybody that could be was there, and they unanimously voted to donate $300 to the 114th Battalion to use in any way they saw fit. So once again, very proud of the battalion and contributing to that Army group. So very, very pleased. The next day, there's another meeting. This is just a plain council meeting for our chief and council, and our chief resigns. His name is Joseph King, and he resigns to join the 114th Battalion and goes off to war. You can't tell me there's not a certain amount of patriotism and excitement as our folks joined this battalion and went off. Now, the 116th Battalion, the 114th Battalion doesn't last too long. It makes its way overseas in November of 1916. And sadly enough, it's broken apart for reinforcements, and the men are moved everywhere through the Canadian forces. Some are regular soldiers of the line, so to speak. Some of them belong to railway troops. Some of them belong to forestry troops, a wide variety. We even have a couple of bandsmen, that actually go with the band and play in Britain to raise morale and so on. So quite a wide variety of jobs we had within that battalion. Now, back up, good, just where I want to be. Now, Cameron Brandt was one of our casualties. You met him earlier. This is our other casualty that actually died in combat. This is Private Maxwell Tobiko. He's also of the 114th Battalion. He dies in 1917, and in the EAP segment again. But sadly, he does not come home. He leaves a father and a mother behind back here in New Credit, and they were really, really hoping for his aid after the war because farming was hard and his parents were a little more elderly. Sadly, he did not come back, but he is our one casualty out of the 114th Battalion. I should say our one fatality from the 114th Battalion. By the way, there were a number of other people wounded. I think there were 3 wounded out of our battalion. So all in all, we came off fairly lucky at New Credit. In terms of total casualties for this war, we lost the two of these people in battle, and 2 gentlemen actually perished before they ever got overseas. They had enlisted but died of types of flu and pneumonia before they actually made it overseas. So that's recruiting for our people in 1915 and 16. First Nations people were welcomed with wide open arms. Mind you, there was no ulterior motive, like I said. Indian Affairs was hopeful that it would assimilate our people. So it's time to move on now. We're going to look at 1917 and 18. Now there's a drastic change. Of course, there's still all these terrible battles going on, like the Somme in Europe. Manpower is low. The Canadian Army has taken a bit of a beating since the middle of April 1916 to the end of 1917. The Canadian Army took about, let me see here, I think I have the number in front of me, about 128,000 casualties, which is quite a substantial amount. And recruiting in Canada was not going well. We lost 128,000. In the same time period, we only recruited about 63,000 volunteers. So you know how that works. You're losing more men than you're taking in. And when you consider, the bloodiness of this war, that presents serious difficulties. You also had Robert Borden that had made the promise to get 500,000 men into the field. Well, right now, the CEF only had about 303,000 men in the field. So way, way below numbers. Something had to be done. And so Borden introduces conscription in August of 1917. Now, remember before 1914, okay, First Nations people they're really reluctant to take them into the army. 1915, 16, it's kind of like, come with open arms, please come in. Now, the goal of the government is to, I don't want to say forcibly, but maybe that's the best way to do it, is forcibly call these First Nations people into the army. And there's a big problem with that because I haven't said it yet, but First Nations were under no obligation to join the military, not in 1914, not in 1915, 16, mainly because, well, like I said, but now they're being forced to join. And that's a problem because First Nations people do not enjoy the rights of Canadian citizenship. And let's face it, they didn't. They did not vote. They could not vote. If they got an education, they had to give up their First Nation status at the time. They're ruled by the Indian Department. In some cases, you can't leave the reserve without permission of the Indian Department. So there's all kinds of things. They do not enjoy the full freedom of citizens. And so First Nations chiefs and council petitioned Ottawa. How can you do this to us? We're not even full citizens yet. You ask us to go and fight on your behalf. And to top it all off, some of our treaties, especially people that have treaties farther out west and in Northern Ontario, you promised us that we would not have to fight. And now you're going to take our young people away from us. What a disaster. Now, some First Nations people simply do not apply, do not register for conscription. We have several of those people at New Credit, and a few of them were actually apprehended by the law for not signing up and not reporting for conscriptive duties. Some, well, I'll put it this way, some fall under a category, well, how do I say this? Let me get my thoughts organized again here. Some, after the government relents, because the government does relent, it realizes First Nations people are wards of the Crown. It realizes we don't have full rights as citizens. So the government resents after chiefs and councils protest, after even newspapers in the rest of Canadian society protest. So the government relents in 1918 and says, okay, First Nations people do not have to participate. Matter of fact, if First Nations have been conscripted, they can be exempted and they can be discharged from the army. And if you haven't been conscripted yet, you may apply through your Indian agent to get out of joining up, and we will readily do that. And on our First Nation, there's about 13 band members that took advantage of the exemption, though some later on did join up and fight anyway, but still a bit problematic for the government trying to conscript First Nations people, and I think rightfully so. If you do not have the full rights of citizenship, how can you be asked to fight for the government? All right, so that's 1915 and 16. Now so we give of our soldiers. We also give on the home front, and we give to the Canadian Patriotic Fund. That's one of the things we give to. The Canadian Patriotic Fund was a fund. It was a private fund set up to help people whose fathers went off to war, set up to help families whose father went off to war. A certain amount of money would be given to these families, and they could hopefully make ends meet while their main breadwinner was off fighting. And so that's something we gave to the Canadian Patriotic Fund. And it was kind of ironic about that. We give $300 to that fund, only to find out that First Nations people were not initially eligible for that. Even though our First Nations warriors here at New Credit, some of them had families, they could not partake of the fund because the secretary of the fund questioned why they should have it as their wards of the government, and the government was responsible for looking after the First Nations people. The government gives them rations, they didn't. The government pays the rent, they didn't. So why should they be entitled to this fund? It wasn't until later on in the war that it was found out that First Nations patriotically gave to the fund that there was a change of mind, and First Nations warriors could receive some of that fund. We also gave of the Red Cross. Our Indian agent, Major Van Loon, could proudly write Ottawa that the women of New Credit contribute to the knitting and making of goods for the war effort and for the men on the front. So we contributed that way. Now, we also contributed in another way, and I gotta keep going because time is moving on here. This is our New Credit United Church. It wasn't the New Credit United Church then, it was just simply called the New Credit Mission Church. But you notice it has a steeple in front of it. And when I first took my job at New Credit, doing some of the historical work, I was always questioned, what do we have from the old Credit River Mission? Because that's where we lived before, the Credit Mission Village. Do we have anything from the time we lived there? And to be honest, I didn't know. And I asked around a little bit, and I was told the story of our mission bell. A bell used to hang in our steeple. We brought it with us all the way from the Credit River Mission. And for a while, this church was built in 1852. For a while before this church was built, it used to hang on a tall pine tree, and it would ring and that would call the new credit people to worship, call them to worship on their Sundays. The church is built in 1852, the bell's installed, and it rings and it calls us to worship for until the war, sometime in the war. And the story, as I've heard it, might be apocryphal, I'm not sure. The story as I heard it, the bell was donated to the war effort. You've heard these stories of scrap metal drives used to make shells to have a go at the enemy. Well, the story has it that our people gave away the bell to use on the enemy during the war, and we lost something very near and dear to us, something very tangible from the Credit River mission that we could never replace. Now, we did try and replace it with another bell, and I was very proud in 2014, when we read out the names of our warriors at Remembrance Day. We actually called for the bell to chime as the warriors' names were read out, a reminder of the sacrifice of the bell. So far, we've come almost to the end, and I just want to, let me advance my slide here a little bit. I want to introduce you just for a moment to Master Sergeant Albert Wilford Laurier Crane. Anybody want? I kind of want to laugh about this a little bit because WL stands for Wilford Laurier, and of course you kind of wonder about his family's political leanings. Albert Wilford Laurier Crane. But anyway, he was one of the first ones to join up along with Cameron Brandt, and I bring him up here because I just want to talk a little bit about motivation. I've stayed away from that a little bit because I don't know why our soldiers went to fight. I have no letters, no stories have come down to me. I've only known one World War I veteran in my lifetime, and I was just a little guy wearing short pants. So I didn't even know what to ask, let alone know that he was a veteran. And so I'm always faced with, why did these people go and fight? Why did our warriors go off and fight? I've often heard, well, there was a residue of old warrior spirit, because of course we were fierce warriors. We fought on the side of the British in different wars. We participated in colonial warfare for years. And so there's that warrior spirit that's innate in us that compels us to go off to war. I'm not so sure about that. I've talked to modern day people that have served, and I've never heard that story. Some people say it's, well, because we have ties to the British Crown. After all these years, we're still mindful of the treaties we have with the British Crown, and in the peace of Niagara, the peace treaty at Niagara, 1764. After Pontiac's rebellion, the Silver Covenant chain of peace was extended, and that tied Britain and the First Nation together. So when Britain is at war, we felt like we had to be at war as First Nations people. I'm not so sure I've ever heard of that. So like I said, I'm never really sure why we fought. But Albert Crane gives me a bit of an idea here. Albert Crane joined up, like I said, with Cameron Brandt in 1914, and he's also at the Second Battle of Ypres, and he's wounded quite badly. He's shot in the thighs, a shoulder wound, shot in the groin as well. My goodness, I hate to think of the poor man. He's listed as dead at first, killed outright. Then later on in the record, it's listed as he's died of his wounds. So which is it? Killed outright or died of his wounds? And then later on, he's found recorded in an aid station behind the lines. From there at the aid station, he's taken to a French military hospital. From there, he gets to Great Britain and has some military treatment there. And then, after he's stabilized a bit, he makes it to Canada, and he's promoted to Master Sergeant. after he's completed more medical treatment here in Canada. He's promoted to Master Sergeant, and he becomes an instructor in bayonet fighting and physical training near London, Ontario. So he's a veteran. He's been wounded. He's got a very important role, lots of responsibility here, training other men to go off to fight. Well, he gets married while he's doing his stint in London. But there's a bit of a fly in the ointment for him. While experiencing success where he is, his mother is needing help at the farm at New Credit, and her other sons have went off to war. So she petitions the Indian Department, remember Duncan, Campbell, Scott, and asks if he can somehow get Albert sent home for help, to help her. She succeeds. He's sent home. He's given a discharge in 1917, and he's home working with his mom. Now here's where, to me, it becomes interesting. One of the reasons people often say First Nations people fought was to increase their autonomy and equality as a people, to make them like equal citizens of the rest of Canadian society. And I like Albert Crane because Albert Crane in 1918 gets involved with a political movement. He's not satisfied to see us as, at the beck and call of the Department of Indian Affairs, having our lives influenced by them all the time. He wants us to be treated properly as a proper Canadian citizen, to enjoy greater rights, to enjoy greater freedoms. So he becomes involved in something called the Thunderwater Movement, or the Council of Indian Tribes. The Council of Indian Tribes is an organization started in the United States, and it's making its way to Canada. And what it wants to do is to promote the welfare of First Nations people and promote greater responsibility and rights for the Indian people in Canada and North America. So a bill goes before the House of Commons, introduced by Chief Thunderwater. We'll talk about that name in a bit. It's kind of interesting. Chief Thunderwater. A bill's introduced to introduce that organization, and it kind of fails. The goals were laudable and so on, but the government did not particularly like Chief Thunderwater and his movement. One, because it stirred up the First Nations people, and they didn't like that. And the other thing, Chief Thunderwater was probably a fraud. He was defrauding the people of the money. In other words, First Nations people that were contributing money to his organization. And there's some rumor, according to the Department of Indian Affairs, that he was not an Indian at all, but he was really a black man from Cincinnati, a half black, half white man from Cincinnati, masquerading as an Indian. And then when somehow revelations of sexual misconduct come to light in Cincinnati, Chief Thunderwater's movement, the Council of Tribes, falls apart, and so goes the dreams of greater equality and responsibility, at least through the Thunderwater movement. Albert Crane, the only reason I knew he was involved in this is because I was researching the Thunderwater movement, and on the bill being read into Parliament was Albert Crane's name listed as a supporter of that movement. Now, granted, Thunderwater was a bit of a fraud, but still, it tells me that Albert Crane was going to work on behalf of the First Nation and was interested in increasing that equality and autonomy of First Nations. So very grateful to him. He goes on, by the way, serves on our band council and serves as one of our chiefs, and actually becomes the first constable we ever had on the band. So that's why I like Albert Crane. He's part of an a political awakening of our people. And when veterans come back from the war, they've, like Duncan Campbell Scott said, they've seen other things, they've interacted with other people. Did they want to be civilized? Not necessarily, but what they did want was a greater role and say in their lives that they weren't getting the way things were. One more slide before I let you go. And I just want to look at my 6 relatives again so you can find out how they fared during the war and maybe see for yourselves. How did they fare? Did Duncan Campbell Scott work in his assimilation plan? Well, let's see. First, we look at Dan here. Dan comes back from the war unscathed and immediately becomes enfranchised. And I don't know for you folks if you know what that means, but what enfranchisement is, it means we as First Nations people give up our right as a status Indian and become like a regular, everyday Canadian citizen with the rights and responsibility thereof. Dan did that. He left the First Nation and he becomes enfranchised. He's married, he has a family, and his wife and his children are not First Nations band members. They're Canadian citizens. Ironically, let me do the math in my head, about 65 years later, when the government realizes that enfranchisement was not very, well, let's just say it's not politically correct, and it was very unjust in many respects. Ironically, the government of Canada opens up band lists again, and lo and behold, his children apply to become members of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. So while he left, his children came on board. The next person we see here is Sam. Sam Herbleform, he was an older man when he joined up. Matter of fact, he was 44 years old when he joined up. He comes back from the war. He comes home to a wife and an adopted child. He comes home to a 50-acre farm. And the great thing, because of the war, Sam is able to take out a loan. He takes out something called a soldier settlement loan. For those of you not familiar with First Nations people, generally we cannot get loans because we cannot use our land as security at the bank if we default on our loans. The bank cannot take our property and hope to get some payment by selling it. So Sam takes advantage of what is called a soldier settlement loan open to First Nations veterans, and he gets farm equipment. And lo and behold, he tries to farm and make a prosperous farm. Tries, I say, because he doesn't succeed very well. And his farm, he has trouble getting the crops to grow well, and he can't pay back his soldier settlement loan. It takes at least until 1932. The government of Canada is still bothering him about the soldier settlement loan, bugging him for repayment. He can't afford to repay. He has to sell his farm equipment. And so that ends his, the loan is gone, but so is his best chance at making a go of farming. So sad for him. But he still lives on the First Nation. And of course, I meet his descendants every day. Third man, Peter Wesley, he's kind of a strange case. He enfranchises in a manner of speaking. He comes back, he's married, and he and his wife move to the United States, where he can't take advantage of his First Nation status. And I guess you would say he's enfranchised by default. I don't know the whole story about why he moved to the United States, but he moves and he lives under an assumed name. We see him coming back to Canada to visit his relatives. You can see the border crossing documents, and that's all we know of him. He disappears from our band records. The next person, I love this guy. Here, this man, Wesley, he's the veteran I knew as a small boy. Didn't know he was a veteran. I used to meet him, his wife, when I used to go with my grandparents to the Market Square in town, and he was selling vegetables and things he had made at his farm. And the remarkable thing I like about Wesley is because he fathered and raised 15 kids, which is a testament in itself. And so, you know, I'm very pleased to have him as a relative, and like I said, a very, very good family man raising these kids. I also suspect shell shock. I did talk to his last surviving son, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and he said his father could not talk about the war, seemed traumatized, but the only time he could really open up about it was when he was, sadly enough to say, intoxicated. But it just goes to show you how I think traumatized he was. Back then it was called shell shock, nowadays post-traumatic stress. I suspect every veteran suffered somehow in some way, shape, or form with post-traumatic stress disorder. Almost there, Elias, he is a brakeman with the Canadian National Railway when he returns. He remains a bachelor. He only lives until 1934, 1935. He's killed on the CNR doing his job. He either fell from a train or was struck by a train. The death certificate isn't really sure. I don't know how they cannot be sure. To me, falling off a train is different from being struck by a train. But nevertheless, he tried to live his life. He still kept his Indian status, but he lived and worked away from the First Nation. And finally, our last gentleman is Herbleform. He's another one, came back from the war and enfranchised. He renounced his Indian status, got married, had children, and gave it up. Ironically, like Dan before him, Dan's children before him, his children also end up joining the banned list about 60, 65 years later, when the government opened up its banned registers again to children of parents that had enfranchised. So that kind of brings me to the end here. I know there's a lot of material to talk about, and there's lots of material that I haven't explored. And I'm only touching the surface of things, folks. I haven't done that much research. I keep hoping that someday somebody else will take it up. One of my fellow band members will take it up and explore this stuff. I'm happy to have the Lauriers here because they're my family members, and so I can know a little bit more about these folks. But I'm really hoping earnestly that there's other band members out there that will take up the cause. So just before I want to close by reading just a brief passage from Cameron Brandt's book. Remember, it was called Songs of Sourdough by Robert Service, has lots of poetry about Canada in it. And for Cameron Brandt, it probably brought back memories of home. So here it is. This is from the poem, The Law of the Yukon. And this is kind of what I feel about our soldiers. Send not your foolish and feeble. Send me your strong and your sane. Strong for the red rage of battle. Sane for I harry them sore. Send me men girt for the combat. Men who are grit to the core. Swift as the panther in triumph, fierce as the bear in defeat, sired of a bulldog parent, steeled in the furnace heat. Send me the best of your breeding, lend me your chosen ones, them will I take to my bosom, them will I call my sons. It's been a pleasure talking to you tonight. As a First Nation person, I'm very glad to be here. I'm thankful for the veterans that fought for us. I know we're still fighting today, maybe a different enemy with this nasty COVID stuff. But let's, even when dealing with COVID, unite together like we did behind the war effort in 1914, 1918, and let's defeat the current enemy just as we help to defeat the past enemy. So thank you for your kind listening, and I will turn you over to my controllers. Is that the term for it? Now, okay, I think I know how to get out of this. Stop sharing.
There we go.
Yes, I'm back to the right. Yes, I'm back.
We're here. We're
Wonderful.
here. Miigwech, Darin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lindsay, do we have anything coming in on the Q&A to share with Darin?
No questions. Some thank yous for the wonderful presentation. Although I have a question, maybe you can answer. I was born and raised in Mississauga, and I'm pretty ashamed to say that for much of my life here, I had no idea about any information about the Mississaugas. And I'm wondering if anyone else there, you might point us in the direction of kind of a good starter resource if we wanted to learn more about the Mississaugas of the credit and their history here and there.
Right. I think one of the best books you can find for our history is one written by Professor Donald Smith. He's out of the University of Calgary. And the book is titled Sacred Feathers. Now, I'm not going to try and pronounce the Indian subname here because I'm just awful at Ojibwe. But it's called Sacred Feathers, the life of the Reverend Peter Jones. And it tells the story of one of our fellow band members, the namesake, Peter Jones, and our life at the Credit River Mission. It gives a good overview of our life before our time at the Credit River Mission Village in 1826. It tells the story of how we ended up at the Mission Village. It tells you how we fared at the Mission Village, and it tells you how we moved to our present location here where we are in Haldimand, Norfolk now. So it's a very good read, and it's very informative. Another good book for First Nations in general, at least Ojibwe nations, is by Peter Schmaltz, The Ojibwe of Southern Ontario. If you ever get a chance to read that, it's not particularly about the Mississaugas of the Credit, but at least you'll get an overview of the Ojibwe people in Southern Ontario. But can't recommend too much Donald Smith's book. Get it. And Donald Smith, if you're out there listening to me, send me royalties or send me finder's fee or something. I'm only kidding. Don't send it.
Thank you. That's perfect.
Thanks. Okay, I'm just going to mute, and I have a question as well. So let's see. I'm just going to mute you guys because we have a little bit of feedback, so I'll take you off in a moment. And for anyone who's got something percolating, please do put it in the Q&A box for us. Darin, my question is around Cameron Brandt's artifacts that you have now. And one thing that you had mentioned was you were able to pretty definitively identify that the book was his because the signature inside of it matched the one on his enlistment papers, which you can find on the Veterans Affairs website. All those attestation papers of the fallen are there, and we've actually got that copy of it on display at the Bradley Museum as part of the Our Boys exhibition. So you can see his signature if you visit it at the Bradley. But my question for you is, with those artifacts of Cameron's that you have, what are the plans to display those and share them with the public?
Well, right now they're on display, I believe, at Fort York right now. I haven't seen the display yet myself, but that's where they were, and we're holding them for safekeeping right now simply because the library at New Credit, where we normally display these things, has undergone some renovation. So right now they're safely on display in Fort York. As far as I know, when they return to us, they'll be on display here at the library again. And I like to, take them around and show them sometimes if I get the opportunity. Just one thing about the attestation, the papers on Library and Archives Canada. I just recently downloaded the Cameron Brandt material again, and I realized it was only 32 pages long. If you actually get the full packet from Indian Affairs, not Indian Affairs, Library and Archives Canada, it's much, much thicker. And what's interesting about it, it tells the very sad tale of his wife, Flossie. His wife, Flossie, tries to get Cameron Brandt's effects back to her, and it takes forever. And that, to me, it makes me wonder, how did that poetry book get back to Canada in the first place? And how did that book get depicted in Ontario and the other place? I don't know whether it came with Cameron Brandt's effects when it was sent to his wife Flossie, or I don't know whether one of his buddies from the war picked it up, tucked it in his rucksack, and brought it back to Canada. It's a bit of a mystery, but interesting to note that all those files are not the complete files. Interesting to note, people, but if you want the complete file, you're going to have to pay the bucks for it.
Thank you for that detail. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I see a comment. We have someone who's said say hi, I am the great niece of Cameron Brandt.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so now let me see. I don't see anything other than that. But welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. So
exactly.
curious.
I'm not surprised because it came from a rather large family when it came right down to it too. So I imagine there's lots and lots of relatives, descendants of Cameron Brandt out there. Well, not direct descendants, but you know what I mean. Family members related to him.
Now, I'm not sure.
See, there's one more question that has popped up. This is from Matthew. He says, thank you, Darin. Always wonderful to listen to you speak. You mentioned the military records of Lieutenant Cameron Brandt. Wondering what kind of military records you have collected for others who have served from the new credit, and were there Mississaugas elsewhere who served from other communities? Oh, there you go.
I'm free to talk again. So anybody that died, I ordered the full file from Library and Archives Canada. So we have Cameron Brandt, we have Albert Crane, not Albert Crane, Maxwell Tobiko. We have John A. Laform, and we have our one deserter that died in custody. Interesting, Joseph Chubb. So those are the records of the individuals that I have, and I've downloaded the Library and Archives files online like you folks have, but like I said, they're usually not the complete files, so they're useful to have. You wish, but they don't tell the whole story.
Let's see here. Now, I'm wondering, because we have a descendant here, and everybody's muted, so I'm not sure if our guest, the descendant of Cameron Brandt, wanted to say something or share anything. They say, thank you for sharing information on my uncle. So that's lovely. That's a nice connection. If you're not already connected, please do feel free to contact us, museums@mississauga.ca. And if you're not connected with Darin, we can make that connection.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it seems like that's where the information is coming from, is just these things like literally coming out of the woodwork with his medals coming out of the mantle.
Oh, it was
like,
just astounding for us. Just astounding for us. Yeah.
Let's see. Well, Darin, your talk was just so You said you're only touching the surface, but for me, it was just comprehensive and so much detail packed into such a short period. Thank you so much for preparing all this information and sharing it with us tonight. We've all learned quite a bit.
Good.
That's very helpful, and I think we'll probably have to look forward to your own book one day.
No, I don't think that's going to happen.
Oh.
People try and talk me into it, but I'm not too anxious. I'm a teacher, not a writer.
Well, we did record this talk, so for the records, it will be shared on the Mississauga Culture website.
Okay.
I actually see another question here that's really good. So,
okay.
Yeah. So just to finish up, this will be shared on the Mississauga Culture website, and we'll share the link with everybody afterwards. And maybe it can be transcribed one day. We'll see.
Oh, good.
Okay.
So our one last question here was, did Cameron have siblings and did they become chiefs?
Some of those relatives still live here at New Credit today. It's not a very big family at New Credit, but as far as siblings go, I can say definitively here at New Credit, no, though they did serve on council from time to time. I cannot speak to what happens at the Six Nations because, of course, they have a whole different way of doing things out there. They have an elected chief and council, but they also have a traditional chief and council. And I don't know if any of Cameron's relatives actually were a part of that.
Thank you.
And my follow-up question to that is the Laforms
Yes.
you shared from your family. You're related. Are there any? I mean, your chief now is a Laform.
Chief Stacy, yes, he's a Laform. The chief before him was Chief Brian Laform, and I don't know, he was chief for quite a long time. Especially, it's probably I'm guessing here since mid '80s or very early '90s. It's been quite a string of Laforms. So it's one of the names. We don't, all band members can trace their ancestry to one of 13 families here at New Credit. And the Laforms are the biggest family. Matter of fact, when you do the family tree, they have a huge family tree. I think when I did the tree, there's something like 1,300 people on it.
Wow.
So, like I said before, everybody's kind of related here at New Credit one way. Most of us have a Laform connection here at New Credit one way. So it's kind of neat. It's kind of neat.
Wow. Well, so we have another question from Heritage Mississauga's historian, Matthew Wilkinson.
I thought I heard of him already.
Well, he's full of questions, that one. I think you were chatting with him recently on their Ask a Historian segment.
Right.
So we're all supporting one another, and he has a question. This is great. Again, the detective work that happens with piecing together this history. He says, is Chubb a Mississauga surname from New Credit? We have a Sergeant Wilburn Chubb listed on the Port Credit War Memorial, and he is also on Alderville First Nation Cenotaph.
That's the Chubbs ended up in Alderville. You've got the right connection. You've got the right connection. They were not here very long at New Credit. Matter of fact, maybe 20, 30 years here at New Credit before they went back to Alderville. No Chubbs any longer here. Hasn't been for years.
Wow.
And then another question also popped up here. Are chiefs elected or hereditary?
At New Credit, we did away with the hereditary chiefs. 1876, I believe it was. We definitely made the move. Progressive people that we are, we kind of pride ourselves on being a progressive people. When we could do it under the Indian Act, we went to an elected system. right away, and we've never looked back. And it's not something we even remotely consider today. And I can really say I cannot think of a time that has not served us well. So no, we haven't had a hereditary chief. Matter of fact, we could have had one in 1876. There was still a hereditary chief alive. He called himself a life chief, but he had no power. He was here, but it was the elected chiefs and councils that held sway after 1876.
Okay, and maybe this will be possibly our last question. I don't know. This question is, how many generations can keep the native status, and can it be lost?
Oh boy, that's always a tough one. Nowadays, we cannot give up our Indian status. So that answers that part of the question. Once you have it, you've got it. You can't renounce it. Now, this is where it gets tough, because every now and then Indian Affairs changes the rules, and I don't always remember and keep up with it. I know, you know what? I'm not even going to say, because I'm going to mislead somebody, and I don't want people all of a sudden running off thinking, oh, I can go get Indian status or something like that. My advice to you is, if you think you might be entitled to Indian status, simply phone the nearest Department of Indian Affairs and ask. They're very up to date with the rules. And to be honest, like I said, it's not something I keep up with. And like I said, they change the rules every now and then.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Is that all our questions tonight? Yes. Wow. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight and for participating. And this has been just so fascinating. And I have fireworks going off in the background. It's not mine. Darin, you did such a great job that the neighborhood's just celebrating.
Wonderful.
For you, I guess.
I just had a police car go by me.
Yes, I noticed that. Oh dear.
I also have fireworks here at the museum, so it's very exciting. It's Diwali.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yay.
Yes.
Diwali. That's exciting. Festival of Lights. Okay, so Darin, thank you as well so much for sharing all this with us and for your time this evening. It's been such a treat hearing you this evening.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it too.
And for, oh my goodness, of course, there we go. I just closed the screen on myself. For those, okay, here we go. For those who are looking for more information, please do visit the Bradley Museum. We are accepting pre-booked tours of the exhibition Our Boys, which is on display until January 10th. And we also have the exhibition War Flowers on display at the Living Arts Center. Both of those are completely COVID safe. They're physically distanced experiences, and everything is cleaned on a regular basis, and we're only allowing groups in from the same household. So we have been operating this way since September, and we're going to keep operating this way and stay open to the community. So please visit our website, mississaugaculture.ca/warflowers, where you can find out more information about those talks, those exhibitions. And we have another speaker coming up in a few days. We are going to be joined by Pardeep Singh Nagra, who is the Executive Director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, and he'll be speaking about the role of Sikh soldiers in Canada and the British Empire in the First World War. And then we will be capping our online speakers series off with Mr. Matthew Wilkinson on November 24th. So he'll have his time to shine as well. And all those details are on our website, mississaugaculture.ca/warflowers. And we will be sending you a short survey after the talk tonight to ask you what you thought and for your feedback. Darin, any final thoughts before we sign off tonight?
No, just once again, I very much enjoyed it, and I hope people do appreciate the roles that other people, other than, like I said, the typical British extraction folks, that they realize that there was other people in Canada that also participated in the war. And it's good that they be remembered.
Absolutely. Very much so. Thank you so much, Miigwech.
Thank you.
And we will be concluding on that note. Have a safe evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.